On this episode of China Unscripted, China is waging economic warfare against the U.S. Does the U.S. have the political will to fight back? And how environmentalism could be America's greatest weapon. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Chung.
And I'm Matt Gnesta.
And joining us today is Senior Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, Christopher Balding. Hey, Chris. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me, guys. Always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So the last time we had you on, it was right before the election. Sort of the Hunter Biden scandal was the big thing in the news. And, a lot of China watchers were, really concerned about what a Biden administration's China policy might look like. We're about a year into the administration. How do you think the Biden administration has done as far as handling the Chinese Communist Party?
I think, honestly, it's a pretty mixed record. There's been a handful of small steps forward. And there's really been, I think, generally speaking, a whole lot of nothing that has happened. In the win column, there is, I think, and I personally would count this as a relatively significant win. In the sense of the Australian sub deal, and I think more than just the direct impact, I think it's a much bigger symbolic impact. But I think one of the things that gets lost in all of that is all the reporting indicates that was a discussion initiated by the Australians, that this was not a U.S.-led project to say, hey, this is something we want to accomplish to help you guys, that this was started and really pushed forward by the Australians. I think there has been, and you just saw, I think it was yesterday, Biden has continued to slowly add a variety of different Chinese companies to the entity list. So I think you have to call those small steps forward. They do appear to to move forward on delisting Chinese companies in a couple of years. Of course, there's a long way to go, but they have released basically a plan to do that. So I do think there are absolutely some small steps, taking place that are positive. I think, however, there is, generally speaking, a lot more standing still and publicity that is taking place than actual action. And by that I mean, just to give you a simple example, the U.S. in the 2021 National Defense Appropriations Act got behind a project called the ORAN Alliance, which is basically intended to make a 5G standard and project, which can make networks interoperable so that you can take any 5G network component from one company and put in the component of another company with no problem. And what makes that an important project is the U.S. government is actually giving out grants to this and companies to push this standard forward. But what's crazy about it is that China and Russia are a part of this alliance. Okay, and Chinese entity list companies, and the Biden administration and senior senators on the Hill are pushing this forward. So even though right now we don't have Huawei or ZTE in U.S. Telecommunications networks, with a couple of small exceptions, we're that seems to be being pushed where we would basically reallow Chinese companies, which are not just being given IP to do this, but are actually being given U.S. tax dollars to do this, and are actually actively participating in coding and developing this entire project. There's different waivers that are being given to Chinese companies, and so I think once you weigh all the let's say forward movement and backwards movement, I would probably give them about a C minus. I wouldn't give them a failing grade, but they definitely have not really, let's say, advanced the ball and significantly raised pressure on China. One last point about this: I think the Olympics is a perfect example. They had been being pressured really from the day they won the election, and and maybe had taken office about, hey, this is something that should take place. And so they basically waited until, the 11th hour to make a decision. I think we're under 60 days here from the Olympics at this point. They waited until a very late period, until other countries had already signaled that they were going to engage in a diplomatic boycott. And it was after China, even hearing of these leaks, said, well, we're not going to invite you anyway. So, consider yourself off the hook. And then, of course, they announce it, and Beijing gets angry that we decided to issue a diplomatic boycott. So I think that's another example where it's like there is forward movement. I don't think you can call it high quality or significantly advancing the pressure on China forward materially. So I think you have to weigh those, how that's unfolding in the overall environment that the Biden administration is creating.
I mean, isn't it a lot better than, George W. Bush going to the 2008 Olympics? I mean, a diplomatic boycott is still the right move, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And so I absolutely do think they should get credit for doing the right move. I mean, make no mistake about that. And that's why I say I think it is probably at the end of the day, if they had put in diplomatic pressure, they maybe could have gotten, maybe some concessions for the athletes when they're in Beijing. They could have, maybe recruited more countries to engage in a diplomatic boycott. I think there's different possibilities like that, where if they had said this is something we want to do, they could have done more.
What do you think about the Biden administration's policies on Taiwan?
I think there is. I think I would be a little bit more optimistic there, in the sense that one of the issues that you're looking forward is that Trump, when it comes to China, really handed off a pretty solid dossier. We've laid a good groundwork for you to continue this line of work. And so the Biden administration record on China, there's definitely a little bit of rolling back. There's a little bit of pushing it forward. I think on Taiwan, they've definitely pushed it forward more, I think a little bit more directly, and really haven't rolled anything back. So I would probably give them a little bit higher grade on the Taiwan issue specifically, probably about a B.
It's weird because, I would overall say the Biden administration has done a fairly good job pushing things forward with Taiwan. But then the weird thing happened at the Democracy Summit, where the Taiwan ministers,
Audrey Tong, and
it got cut. The feed got cut, and it was just audio only. And then she had like a picture of like Taiwan and China, and Taiwan was a different color, and then that got cut. And it's like no one really knows what's going on.
But the U.S. invited Taiwan to the Democracy Summit.
Yeah, but it's weird.
Hard to understand.
That seems like kind of low-level fumbling to me.
Well,
like somebody freaked out about it, and then they didn't have a good way to address it.
Well, yeah, that's what's weird. It's like they invited Taiwan. That was a huge move. But then, like according to sources speaking to Reuters, it was a deliberate move to cut the feed of the Taiwan minister. And, the State Department denies this, but like at the end of the feed, there was like this message that pops up that says like, the views and opinions of anyone speaking here today do not represent the U.S. government, which makes it sound like it was a little more deliberate.
There are two specific stories that came out. One of them is that the White House is watching this feed. They see this and they go ballistic and they start yelling at the State Department. The State Department pulls the feed. The other one is that out of the White House was that this was solely a State Department decision to do this. I don't have any way of knowing which version of that unfolding of events is accurate. Let's assume, like a lot of conferences, the State Department says all speakers send in your PowerPoints a week ahead of time or something like that. Okay. I'm going to assume that happened. Okay. I mean, I would be surprised if, the State Department didn't say, we want to review the PPTs before they go up. I'm assuming then that somebody in the State Department basically signed off on the PowerPoints that she was going to present. I would be skeptical to say that, Taiwan got some slides approved and then tried to slip this in under the noses of the State Department. So at that point, there's it would appear that it got signed off on by somebody inside the U.S. government, and then somebody else inside the U.S. government said, we don't like that Taiwan is a different color. Whoever that is, I can only guess. I mean, there's two different stories. What the truth is, I don't know. I think more than anything, it's a bad look. If the Biden administration had just said, because they drew more attention to it than probably anyone would have cared, otherwise. I mean, they Streisanded what happened, really. And I think more importantly, if they had just said, hey, we're not responsible for those slides, China, we still adhere to the one China policy, our historical one China policy, that would have been a better response than what they did.
Yeah, this is why it seems like some weird fumbling to me, like the people were trying to CYA and it didn't go well.
Yes, absolutely. And it really does, I think, appear, rather incompetent. And I think it makes them look not so good and really like they're trying to please placate China.
Well, you mentioned something earlier about this deal where like Huawei might be able to get parts in U.S.
Well, like set the standards for 5G, right?
Yeah.
Is that this ORAN alliance thing?
Yeah, so it's actually more than standard setting, which they are standard setting, but it's actually an industry alliance, and so it includes all the big Chinese global and China included telecom service providers like your T-Mobiles, your AT&Ts, China Mobile, China Unicom, all these guys. In Europe, Japan, other countries like that. And then it also includes big component makers, Nokia, Ericsson, Intel, Microsoft, Google, all these guys. And then it also includes small players, research institutions, all this kind of good stuff. And so they're not just standard setting, they're actually developing the products in concert. And so it actually has a couple of unique wrinkles in the sense of the companies, as part of joining this alliance, part of the agreement is that you agree to license intellectual property that comes out of this to other companies in the alliance. And so there's probably 30 or 40 Chinese companies that are in this alliance. Many of them there's a number of them that are entity list or on the U.S. government PLA owned list. And of course, many of the ones that, you've never heard of are, very tightly linked to the government, some of them even the military. And so think about this, the U.S. government is backing this project, and we are requiring U.S., European, Japanese companies to license intellectual property to these Chinese companies, okay? Because that's part of the alliance agreement. The other part is that in the development, because again, they're not just standard setting, they're actively developing these products. As part of the development, Chinese companies are actually helping to develop the code and hardware for this. So this means the Chinese PLA and also tangentially Russian companies get access to the entire source code that is going to make up the ORAN product line that U.S. government hopes will go into U.S. telecoms network. Now, to me, I personally just think it's absolutely, Looney Tunes that we would, basically hand over source code for U.S. telecom networks or parts of U.S. telecom networks to the Chinese PLA and Russian security services. But again, I'm an extremist according to some.
So how long has this been going on?
So the alliance itself was founded in 2018, and it was probably 2019-20 before it really started gaining attention and getting political support. And so in the 2021 National Defense Appropriations Act, which was actually passed in December 2020, a year ago, with some funding for this year, it was received support from Senator Mark Warner and Marco Rubio, with Senator Warner coming out of a telecoms background and Senator Rubio wanting to demonstrate his anti-China credentials.
Wait, so they supported it?
They said they supported this, yes, and so there was actually some funding, and I want to say it was a total of about up to $1.5 billion that could be used to help fund research, things like that that went into this overall project. Yes,
I'm confused because you said Rubio supported it, but he supported it in order to.
Yes. So So what happened is there would be, like, for instance, like, there are U.S. companies in this, like Qualcomm, things like that. So if they came to the U.S. funding agency and said, hey, we're going to do research on XYZ aspect of interoperability, is the keyword. We're going to do, and we estimate this specific part of research to cost $50 million or something like that to further ORAN objectives. Development costs, things like that. Different companies could secure funding from the U.S. government to push to help push the ORAN concept forward.
But you said Rubio was doing it because he wanted to burnish his anti-China credentials, but it seems like this is helping China. Am I not getting it?
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. And so it is rather puzzling. And honestly, like, I have tried repeatedly and I cannot get any type of satisfactory answer. I can't really get an answer from anyone as to how this is helping to secure U.S. telecoms networks from adversaries like China and Russia. Because again, it's not just China, it's not just Russia. Why would you want to give countries like that key source code, license them U.S. intellectual property? That is going into, next generation technologies in U.S. telecoms networks.
Well, so given how allowing China to join this is, stupid, why did it get to the point where decision makers were like, yeah, let's let China join, let's let Russia join? Like, why didn't we just make it an American thing or maybe an America-EU thing?
There's a couple of things. This was initiated by some of the key corporations, globally in the telecom space, and the telecom service providers basically were complaining that they thought they were overpaying for network equipment. So one of the key aspects of, like, Huawei's ETE is that they charge, let's say, about 30% less on average, for the straight sticker price of gear than, like, a Nokia or an Ericsson. So telecom service providers, your T-Mobiles, your AT&Ts, Verizons, et cetera, and similar companies around the world, were basically saying, hey, we need to create more competition in this space. Because basically, globally in the network market, in the network equipment market, you basically have Huawei, ZTE, Nokia, and Ericsson. So if you're going to tell an American telecom service provider that is going to build a 5G network that you can't use ZTE or Huawei, you're basically left with two companies. So they thought they were overpaying. So they said, we need to make these networks. Oh, and also the networks didn't really work together. Okay, so you could run 50% of the country on Nokia and 50% of it on Ericsson, but you couldn't just take out a Nokia part and put in an Ericsson part. Okay, it didn't work that way. So they said, what if we could have these networks so that I could rip out a Nokia part and just stick in an Ericsson part when it broke or became obsolete? And so it was really pushed by the telecom service providers and some of the smaller network equipment providers. But what they did is they went to the politicians and said, look, get behind this project because this becomes a way for you to foster a national champion. So you actually had smaller countries in Europe getting behind this because they said, hey, we don't like that those Scandinavians, control everything. So if I'm France, if I'm Germany, if I'm, some of these other countries, I can get behind this. The American politicians got behind it because they said, hey, this is possible for us because America doesn't really have a key company here. And also this helps us get away from China. But what the alliance had started doing is they had started letting Chinese companies in. I suspect on the political side that basically they are very close with telecom providers, and so they went along with what the telecom providers were telling them, and they did not actually research what are the key details of this alliance and who are the companies that are going to have access to this technology. So I suspect that on the political side, it's the same. It's a very similar story of big money and not actually researching the topic that they were basically spending public money on.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems so.
Well, like everything that was being done with like the clean 5G networks.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Like the Trump administration made this huge push for clean 5G,
getting Chinese telecoms, particularly Huawei, out of any kind of global telecommunications chain.
But then at the same time, this other thing was going on, and now we're funding it.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, so this is kind of an issue. Like, there's always like. Any move forward by any administration always seems to be messed up by like these, like either like in this case, it seems like you're saying that telecommunications companies are responsible for giving China a backdoor. We also constantly have issues with like Wall Street, the Ray Dalio type people. And this is significant because I think one of the biggest weapons the United States has against the Chinese Communist Party right now is economic leverage. Like we were talking about the blacklists earlier of Chinese tech companies. Well, all right, let's talk about the blacklist thing for a moment. Like, is this an effective economic weapon the U.S. can use? And then we'll kind of talk about what we can do about the Wall Street and Ray Dalio types.
I think there is. I think there are actually valid reasons to say it's a nice little kind of like, cherry on top, but you cannot use sanctions as a primary tool. Primarily because they really aren't that effective, especially on companies. Because especially in China, what we will see, and I've seen cases like this where, if the U.S. government sanctions, Chinese Acme Military Co., what they will do is they will literally, and I've seen a couple cases like this where literally they will go out on the day after that they're sanctioned. They're at dinner in Beijing and they get word, oh, my company just got sanctioned. They will go out and within a couple of days, they will have, Chinese Acme Military Co. 2 at the same address with the same CEO, the same shareholders, same everything. And now they're selling, their shoulder fired missiles to, street gangs in, some country, under that corporate name rather than the one that got sanctioned. Okay, so because it takes quite a period of time and a lot of work to put Acme 2 on the sanctions list, it basically turns out to be, generally speaking, pretty irrelevant. Okay.
What's a Huawei though? Like, there's not like some other company that's taken over Huawei's role, right? Look, under a different name that's selling components to the U.S., or is there that we don't know about? Or I don't know about.
So I think there's a couple answers to that. So first of all, one of the things you've seen is you've definitely seen, let's say, some black market telecoms parts that are probably leaking out that probably should have Huawei on a sticker on the product, but they put somebody else's sticker on there. Okay. Also, what you've seen is you've actually seen Huawei, for instance, like they sold their handset division to a Shenzhen government company. Okay, it's basically a Shenzhen government SOE, and so now there is a valid question: does the Huawei handset division carry that sanction, or can this Shenzhen government company now sell old Huawei handsets into the United States market with this new brand name? Especially since they're basically made at the same plants with the same people, with the same chips, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have seen some of that even with Huawei. I think for a company like Huawei, the bigger concern is less about selling into the U.S. With any material degree, and more about the products that they would be able to buy from U.S. companies. And this is especially true of like Chinese chip companies. We're less concerned about buying Chinese chips than we are about Chinese chip companies buying key products that they would use to make semiconductors. Okay. And so that's in a way a little bit easier to control than trying to keep up with every new company that they start in China to sell the same products with.
Well, so isn't that a function of some of these blacklists, that it's not just we can't buy their stuff, but Americans aren't allowed to invest in these companies, you can't sell to these companies?
Yes, and so this gets to a much larger issue, and just to as a comparison's sake, the Uyghur forced labor bill basically is very important here. Less because I want to go down the road of Uyghurs, which of course is an awful issue of itself, but the Uyghur bill is something very important, which you could say maybe is an idea we need to think about with regards to Chinese tech companies. It used to be basically what they're doing is they're changing the presumption of guilt for products that are shipped to the United States out of Xinjiang. The previous standard was the US government had to prove that a product was made with forced labor if we wanted to block it from entering into the United States. Okay. Well, how do you go and prove that products are made with forced labor in Xinjiang? That's a very difficult thing to do. Okay. You can't really do that because you're not even really allowed to go in there. Okay. So how do you know whether it's made with forced labor? You can't really prove it. So what the forced labor bill is doing is that it's actually changing the presumption of innocence into you as a company, if you want to import something into the United States from Xinjiang, you have to prove that it's not made with forced labor. Okay, so we're basically treating all products from Xinjiang as guilty from the start. And then if you say, I actually have a pressing interest, I can prove that this is not made with forced labor, then you can get it into the country. So that standard change is very interesting. And I'm not saying we necessarily apply that same standard to all Chinese tech, but it's definitely maybe an idea worth exploring because otherwise, whether it's exports to China for sensitive goods or whether it is imports from this new handset division owned by the Shenzhen government, you're basically always chasing, it's basically whack-a-mole.
Isn't it with the Xinjiang thing, though? I mean, how easy is it for these companies to just ship it to another province in China or ship it to Cambodia or Italy or somewhere else before shipping it to the U.S.?
I mean, they're literally taking Uyghurs from Xinjiang and putting them on trains and sending them off to other cities to be involved in factory work, right?
And so this actually, like one product I can, in addition to the example you just cited, Matt, I think one of the other ones that I've seen reports, for instance, that they're basically sending tomatoes from Xinjiang. They're importing just vats of tomatoes into Italy from Xinjiang, putting them in cans and labeling them made in Italy. Now the tomatoes might have been grown in Xinjiang, but they were bottled in Italy, and so they will be shipped to different countries labeled as made in Italy.
It's a fraud.
I don't.
Okay, and so one of the issues here is, and I was talking with someone very recently about this, is if you do it on a country by if you do it on, for instance, a company by company basis, it's playing whack-a-mole. But I don't know if we're at the point there of we can sanction either all Chinese technology or, something like that, or even, for instance, like the country of China yet. But we clearly need to move beyond a policy where we're just playing whack-a-mole or even Xinjiang, because I think you can see very, very quickly, Chinese companies are going to figure out ways around this Xinjiang standard. And then we're going to be onto the second layer, and that's going to apply, okay, how do we basically expand this so we're not letting in basically products from Xinjiang that are relabeled as something else?
Well, so I think you've made a pretty convincing point for why sanctions are not the best economic tool the United States has. What do you think what would be an effective economic tool the United States could do?
So I think one of the things is that the China has this concept of a basically some type of civil military fusion. In the United States, you've seen in the United States, you've seen like there were some hearings a couple of years ago with I think the FBI director, where he talked about a whole of society type of approach. And I think one of the things is I think throughout the U.S. government and even in a lot of the United States, even people I would say, and I mean this positively, that I think are pretty concerned about China, aren't necessarily ready to recognize the depth of what that means and how we have to maybe change policy or change behavior. What I mean by that is, just as an example, I would say, we need to engage in a policy of saying, okay, we could not decouple from China within 3 months. I mean, it would simply be, very hard, like in the tech space. One of the things we could do, however, is we could actively say we're going to provide incentives for companies to basically shift production away from China to India, to Mexico, places like that, so that, a lot of those, like, let's say lower, Trump got criticized for tariffs, which raised prices and things like that. But, one of the things that can be said for that is, price is the best signal. And so if you can raise prices on those imports, because let's be honest, most of those products that are made in China, they're never going to be made in the United States for some time. But if we can say, hey, how do we shift some of those supply chains to India, to Mexico, to Latin America, to Vietnam, different places like that, that is going to start that discussion and really focus government policy on what are the risks we're running from Chinese technology? What are the risks we're running from very concentrated supply chains that are heavily dependent on an adversarial state? And so I think there needs to be a broad push to do something like that.
That's an interesting idea. I think Japan has done something like that, right? Where they're trying to incentivize companies to move out of China.
Yes, and so they're actually providing subsidies, especially for like different technology manufacturers or whatever, to either move to Japan or move to other approved countries like Vietnam. Japan has a lot of companies in Vietnam. South Korean companies account for a very material percentage of GDP in Vietnam. So I think, whether it's Vietnam, India, in some cases it might be moved back home. But I do think we need to engage in a much broader debate about and discussion about how can we focus policy, not just on like sanctioning a couple of companies, but how can we engage in really a much broader approach, much more broad-based approach to de-risking ourselves from engagement with China.
What happens if, I'm thinking about what China is doing now to Lithuania, where they're telling, these multinational companies, well, if you want, like, you have to cut ties with Lithuania or you lose access to the Chinese market. So what happens if, the US tries to incentivize tech companies to move production out of China, and then China says, hey, Apple, if you do this, you lose the China market?
So one of the things is that the U.S. actually has types of laws for that type of situation with regards to Israel. Right now, we don't have similar laws for that situation with regards to China. So one of the things might be doing something, passing some laws like that. The other thing that would be very feasible is the United States has to move beyond simply trying to persuade allied and democratic countries to treat China as more of a challenge. We have to bring resources to bear. And resources to bear could be everything from trade agreements to development financing for countries like India and Vietnam. But basically, we have to bring more resources to bear. And that could be everything. That could even mean just providing investment incentives. Like if you shift production to India, we will provide a tariff waiver for 5 years for textiles and garments that are no longer produced in China, but are produced in India. As an example, but we have to bring actual resources to bear rather than just trying to persuade countries or companies to behave differently.
I mean, I can see, that helping, but I mean, I'm talking like nuclear option. China just says, you're going to lose access to our entire market. Like for a company like Apple, if they weigh incentives for moving production to India versus, losing access to the entire thing, is there anything we can do about, is there anything the US government can do?
It would very much not surprise me if so basically right now a lot of companies like Apple are very much trying to placate both sides, and basically there's no way around it. I mean, is the bottom line. You have seen companies that have basically said this is not a place that we can exist peacefully in. So one of the things, a lot of the ways companies are trying to handle this right now is basically, for lack of a better term, is they're basically creating increasingly separate production or supply chain channels, in the sense of, China, Apple, as an example, they've created a large manufacturing presence in India to serve the non-Chinese market, and they continue to move production there. Okay. So one of the things you see is companies creating, this is my supply chain for the Chinese market. This is my supply chain and manufacturing base for the non-Chinese market. Okay. You see this happening a lot with IT networks. Because theoretically, the Chinese law says if you are Microsoft or if you're Apple, if you're somebody else, if you have an IT presence in China, theoretically, we have access to your entire, we by law will have access to your entire computer network globally. So one of the things you're seeing is you're seeing companies saying, okay, this is going to be our Chinese IT network, and anybody that outside of China that deals with our China team, you're going to be on that network. Everybody else, we're creating a completely separate IT network for you. And so you're seeing that, and it would not surprise me if within the next 5 years, we see that decoupling become much more pronounced, let's say, a harder line in the sand, where companies have to say, do I want to sell to China or do I want to sell to the rest of the world? Because I can't do both. And we have seen companies like that, individual companies be put in that position in the past, say, couple of years. I think it would not surprise me if that day comes where a much larger swath of companies have to make that decision.
It really is just a global choice of Western liberal democracies or China. Who leads the world order?
We can make so much money in China, Chris.
Thank you, Ray Dalio.
And look, I mean, since you guys mentioned Dalio the other day, I don't know if you saw, but the Global Times was touting Ray Dalio as his company was the first to reach the 10 billion RMB assets under management in China mark, as the largest asset manager, the largest foreign asset manager in China. That's not a coincidence. Okay. I mean, that is the basic deal that companies like Bridgewater make, is if you want to be in the Chinese market, this is what you do.
Well, invest basically in RMB in China.
One of the things is China is playing their leverage very well. If you're taking it from the Chinese perspective, one of the best examples is CocaCola. They were lobbying heavily against the Uyghur bill, the forced labor bill, and they were basically asked, well, why are you lobbying against the forced labor bill? It only applies if you're exporting product from Xinjiang to the United States. Now,
right, but their secret ingredient is Uyghur tears.
Oh God.
Oh, so that was the old Coke, okay?
Okay, yeah.
This is new Coke.
So they were asked, well, why are you lobbying against this? You don't have any stake in this. You never export Coke from Xinjiang to Los Angeles. I mean, the cost it makes no sense economically. What do you care? What was basically came out is Beijing was saying, you guys lobby against this or we're going to make your life hell. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So even though this had no impact on Coke, okay, because again, the only way you get in trouble from this bill is if you are exporting something from Xinjiang to the United States. So Coke, this had no impact on them, but they said, we were basically told Beijing will make our life hell if we don't lobby against this bill. It's not enough to just take no position. It's not enough to just take no position. we have to actively lobby effectively on behalf of Beijing.
Wow.
Xinjiang makes sugar, right? Like, do they use any Xinjiang sugar in there? But like, they
Coca-Cola doesn't use sugar.
Well, I mean, they
Only
don't
in
use
the US.
That is true. They don't use sugar in the U.S. So then,
yeah.
if they could, they get in trouble for using Xinjiang sugar in China. Maybe not.
No, it's only if it's so the United States, so the forced labor bill does not apply if you make something in Xinjiang and ship it to Zhejiang. US law has no application. Okay, it is only if there's an export that goes from Xinjiang to the United States. Okay, and typically, theoretically, it can be applied to inputted, like a primary input. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
In practice, that's very hard to do. Okay, that's very hard to do. Okay, but theoretically it could apply, but it doesn't really. Okay, so unless they're directly importing Coke from Xinjiang to the United States, this has no impact on Coke. But they were lobbying for this effectively at the behest of Beijing,
because Beijing is making Western companies choose,
yes.
Essentially.
Well, I mean, I think we've seen this over the summer too, them starting to make Chinese companies choose.
Yes.
Like you talked earlier about delisting, Chris, but actually, like Didi just delisted from the New York Stock Exchange, not because of pressure from the U.S., but from pressure from China. Do you think that the Chinese Communist Party, they're going to essentially try to do what you're saying, like bifurcate the system?
I think they are trying to bifurcate the system. Absolutely. At the same time, I got to say, especially with the Didi case, but even their broader policy here, I'm a little puzzled by. And here's basically why. So the basic reason that they're giving for the Didi one is that their data security concerns about Didi listing in the United States. First of all, China has maintained a very strict policy that basically all corporate records in China for firms that list outside of China are national security secrets. And this goes for accounting records. This goes, for, basically anything having to do with any company, whether or not they produce missiles or just, whatever it is. So that data really hasn't been turned over to U.S. regulators for more than a decade. Okay, so my first issue is I don't know what data Didi would even be providing to U.S. regulators. Okay, I can't get anybody to tell me like, well, actually, there's this little loophole or whatever that Chinese companies give to U.S. regulators. So I don't know what data they would be giving the U.S. regulators. So that specific example doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. That specific explanation, I should say. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Let's say very clearly, however, that Chinese data management practices are absolutely terrible. Okay, I mean, make no mistake about it. Not just they're scooping up data on foreigners around the world, but that they do actively just have very incompetent people inside these companies managing user data. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The other reason that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense is that New York Stock Exchange and being able to raise money in the United States and in other foreign jurisdictions is actually very important to get US dollars for Chinese companies that want to expand abroad. Okay, so that's another thing. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense as to why they're trying to cut off that avenue of financing for Chinese companies. But I do think very fundamentally what you said initially about bifurcating the system. Yes, I think absolutely they have made the decision that barring a U.S. collapse where we say, okay, you don't have to provide any data, any financial records if we ask. I do think they have basically decided, yes, we're going to bifurcate our financial system from the United States.
Well, it seems like China is aware of the economic leverage of the United States, particularly, as you mentioned, China's dependence on U.S. dollars, which is why I think you start to see more and more Chinese companies dual listing on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, China trying to make its own digital currency. How do you see China trying to sort of insulate itself from any kind of economic leverage the U.S. has?
So I think, I think you've seen this a lot of what we've seen out of China in the past couple of years has really been about that entire issue. Whether it's the biggest one, a big one, I should say, would be self-sufficiency in chips. That has been a major issue. I think you've seen this this is why they want to send companies that might list in New York. They're not sending them back to Shanghai. They're sending them back to Hong Kong, where they could still access basically what amounts to hard currency. Because with most examples, the RMB is not really hard currency. Okay, you can't really use it outside of China. You've seen a couple of small examples where they've signed deals with, Zimbabwe, and hey, if China wants to sign, an RMB agreement with Zimbabwe, knock yourself out is my opinion. Have fun with that. But they are absolutely sending them to Hong Kong because they can still get U.S. dollars. So I think the overall focus, a major focus of Chinese policy is to basically insulate themselves, whether it's technologically. You've even seen this in, basically shutting down data flows. One that, happened recently is they passed this data privacy law, and basically even run-of-the-mill data providers in China now aren't providing data to foreigners. And again, this isn't like, hey, where's China store the nuclear launch codes? This is, what is basic business data? They just aren't providing to foreigners now. And so I think you are seeing that China is taking the decoupling bull by the horns. In America, we sit and talk about it. China's actually doing it.
So do you think this represents like a danger for the U.S. then?
I think it's a danger, but I think more in the sense of China's doing this for a reason. They're not doing it for no reason whatsoever. The first place your mind would go would be, well, they're preparing for war. Okay, with Taiwan, and what would happen if we faced serious sanctions after we invaded Taiwan or something like that. Okay, that's the first place your mind drifts. I don't necessarily think that is maybe the driving factor, but I do think absolutely they are preparing for, let's say, continued trimming of any engagement with the international community. I mean, they are becoming, let's say, kind of like almost a North Korea light at this point. I think is a better way to put it. And so I think they are preparing not just for, the next year with, COVID, but I do think they are preparing for a sustained period of Chinese history where they continue to minimize any interaction with the outside world.
It's interesting because Xi Jinping basically said in the most recent 5-year plan last year something about increased self-sufficiency for China on things like what you mentioned, like semiconductor chips and those issues, but also to continue to have the world rely on China economically,
and to continue to get people like Ray Dalio to invest money in China.
I don't know if that was said so explicitly, but do you think they can do this where they can essentially insulate themselves and yet have the rest of the world still rely on them in this like have your cake and eat it too kind of way?
If you just look at their basic export numbers, I think that's absolutely what they're accomplishing right now. And this is also why I say one of the things I would really push is it's simply not good policy. Okay, even if even if China were a great friend, it's simply not good policy to concentrate your supply chains. It's simply not good policy to rely on somebody that is taking that much of an adversarial position. Okay. And so, this is why I think we have to engage in a much broader discussion of what is it going to take for us to say, okay, American company, if you want to sell to the Chinese market, that's your business. We can't and shouldn't really try to stop you, but we can absolutely say you should not be relying on Chinese companies or Chinese production capacity if you want to sell into the United States. Okay. High tech or otherwise. And part of this is also, if we want to change the discussion with our allies, from India to the UK, we need to say, hey, we're not just saying, hey, India, come on, think like we do. but we're providing tangible benefits to thinking like we do. Say what you will about China, they get a lot of stuff done because, every Huawei salesman shows up with the China Development Bank loan officer. Okay. So they can show up and say, you buy my product, this guy will approve you this afternoon. Okay. Some guy shows up and says, I'm going to build a plant. This is my loan officer. He's going to look at it and approve the loan this afternoon so we can start building this plant. And we need to, in an American way, be able to provide tangible resources and benefits to our allies to say, we can change this so we are not as reliant on China.
So this is definitely something China is leveraging its economic might, like whether it's, the investment bank deals in third world countries or, the access to the China market for CocaCola. But this is the question I have. China's economy is crazy. Just look at Evergrande, what's happening in the real estate market. If China really does create its own economic system, its own economic bubble, won't that just implode on itself?
So it's one of those things the Chinese economy is a mess. Make absolutely zero mistake about that. Predicting an implosion or a slowdown, I had somebody tell me, they says, actually what you saw was the USSR economy basically get into the problems that ultimately brought it down. They were saying as early as the 50s. And so 40 years later, it collapsed. Okay. 40 years later, it collapsed. So predicting an implosion of, the Chinese economy, look, people have asked about Xi Jinping, and I would say, well, look, if Xi Jinping dies of a heart attack, in a month, that wouldn't surprise me. If Xi Jinping ruled for another 25 years, that also wouldn't really surprise me. Okay. So predicting some type of implosion or something like that, I think is a very dangerous policy plank to hang your hat on. And I think we would need to approach it as we need to expect that China's economy is going to keep plugging along, regardless of what their true growth rate is going to keep plugging along for the foreseeable future. And at the very least, we need to make it much harder for them to carry out their economic policies of gaining influence in other countries around the world.
It's a really good point. It's we should just read what they write in their white papers and their 5-year plans and, design our policy around them continuing to accomplish the things that they say they're going to do. Because they whether it's the South China Sea or building up its military or, literally considering themselves at war with the US, they're doing all these things and they're telling us that they're going to do them. And then they do them. Our policy is designed as if those things aren't going to happen. So we should design them as if the things that they're saying they're going to do, that they are going to do, and not the opposite of just pretending that it's going to collapse next month. And
well, I guess this is the fundamental issue. You've been talking about things the U.S. can do, and certainly you're not alone in saying these things. We've talked about it on the show. It's very clear what the U.S. needs to do, but it always seems like there's an issue of actually generating not just the political will, but the economic will and the support within the U.S. population. How can we actually achieve that? All your suggestions are great, but how do we actually get Wall Street to change its views? How do we get politicians in the U.S. government to actually take these issues seriously?
So I'll take an issue that I've written about before, and I apologize for using one of my soapbox issues, but I think this is a good place to start. So one of the things that we've talked about is, well, how do we get allies? How do we get places like Wall Street, other some of these different groups to say, hey, we can agree on something here. And I'll just take one example. So the United States, the Biden administration, in things like the Build Back Better bill that is floundering in Congress and stuff like that, there's money set aside for like expanding access to renewable energies and environmentally friendly energy and things like that. Well, personally, I think this is a bad bang for the buck, for lack of a better term. And what I mean by that is basically the U.S. for really the past, let's say, almost 20 years has actually been declining its total CO2 output. We're always thought of, and in some ways we are, not great environmentally, but the amount of CO2 that we've been producing has been going down very steadily for 20 years. The amount of coal that we are burning in the United States has dropped. But when you look at where the expected growth of CO2 emissions and coal consumption is taking place, it's taking place in places like South and Southeast Asia. It's taking place in Africa. Okay, so where is the growth going to happen in CO2 emissions? That's where it's going to happen. The reason I give you that background is it would be much better, rather than putting up solar panels in Massachusetts, it would be much better to say, let's capitalize something like the U.S. agency, the Development Finance Corporation, and say, we're going to go into Vietnam. We're going to go into places like India, which have large amounts of solar power. Okay, or large amounts of solar radiation, Africa, and say and these are countries that are starved for electricity. Okay, so these are countries where they need a lot more electricity. They're growing very rapidly. Okay, where we can go in and say we're going to finance renewable energy for you at some type of at lower rate. So that your country can have access to cleaner energy, make a bigger impact on the environment at large, especially over the next 20 years, as this is where electricity growth is rapidly taking place. This is going to help with allies. This is going to need some sophisticated financing, for hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. And so there's a way we could do some type of like public-private partnership where you can get a lot of those disparate groups on, because now, you can sell it to the Republicans as, hey, we're getting, U.S. influence and things like that. You can sell it to the Democrats as, hey, this is environmental responsibility and building and getting allies. You can get Wall Street, on board with the fees that they're going to be getting and expanding U.S. business interests around the globe.
How environmentalism can help us defeat China.
Yes, exactly. And so those are the types of things where it's like, I think there are avenues to do this. And in relative terms, compared to the hundreds of billions of dollars that they're talking about for some of these projects in the US, if you literally just had, even a couple $1 billion a year, you could turn that into, big things in other parts of the world.
That's a pretty cool idea. I have not heard that presented before.
And you could do a similar thing with like 5G, because people talk about 5G, but really you're talking in probably the low to mid single digits a year in network spending on 5G equipment, in 2022, things like that. You're probably starting to get up into the $5 and $6 billion. But that's the kind of thing where the U.S. government could offer, for instance, to Latin American countries, Asian countries, where if they agreed to keep Chinese network companies out, we could give them concessionary financing to buy non-Chinese, whatever company they wanted to buy it from, Japanese, Korean, European. But as long as they did that, we could set up a financing vehicle where we could provide them financing at very low interest rates to buy non-Chinese gear.
It's basically a green alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes, absolutely. And we could do the same for to combat like 5G. So it would keep out Huawei and ZTE from countries. And we're providing tangible resources, not just trying to persuade countries.
Well, yeah, the Huawei ZTE, that's a huge part of China's Belt and Road. So any U.S. alternative would also sensibly. They're doing everything we should be doing. Think about that.
But they're doing it, but evilly.
Well, it's just much easier when you have state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks and whatever to do a state-run policy like.
That's the solution. The U.S. government needs to collude with the banks and all the manufacturers and put, a government branch in each of these so-called private American companies and just tell them what to do.
Are we that far from that?
Well, with the banking industry,
I think it's the other way around. I think it's that the companies...
The banks have their people in government. And
when the waters mix, you can't separate it out.
Yeah.
Now I'm terrified.
So all this is to say, I do, and so this is why I say I think there's more than anything. I think it needs to, rather than just saying, hey, let's issue some sanctions on Chinese companies. I think we need to come up with a broader plan, broader policy initiative where we are bringing resources to bear. And I think even some of the policy objectives that we talk about for domestic issues are things where we could say we're going to push these policy initiatives globally. The environment, clearly, we're not going to be able to provide enough solar panels to India for all their energy needs. We can absolutely say, hey, we want to be a part. We want to partner with you. We want to change the policy direction as an open liberal democracy to say, I think we both are very concerned about China.
Do you think that the U.S. is there kind of policy-wise in terms of it almost sounds like the whole a few years ago the CCP was talking about going out into the world, and this is kind of, you're saying like what the U.S. needs to do is go out and like take some leadership and work with these countries. Are we there politically?
I don't think we're there politically, and I think even among a lot of people that I respect that I think consider China a real problem, I don't think there's the readiness yet to embrace, let's say, the broader policies that I'm talking about that require real resources. I think they're like, hey, we need to do something about China. Let's sign a petition. We need to do something about China. Let's sanction this company. I don't think there is politically yet, even among people, again, that I consider, respectable people that I do think are very concerned about China. I think there's still a real willingness among most people to, nibble around the edges without jumping into, yes, this is a problem we need to solve and we need to do something and we need to take a broad-based approach to this. If you look at a lot of the debates, there's still a lot of professors are still debating whether or not China has is trying to influence universities.
Exhibit A.
Why we're even having this debate, I have no idea. Okay, but people are still having that debate, and you see those similar type of nibbling around the edges debate in a lot of areas, rather than we need to get on board with a broad-based policy initiative. We need to bring resources to bear. We need to go out into the world and work with countries and bring resources to bear to challenge China.
Well, it sounds to me like the issue is like a mental barrier. Like it's easy for people to see an authoritarian regime like China as something that needs to be contained or defeated. But the idea that the U.S. itself should act like a superpower, should be a dominant force in the world, should impose its will in some way or another in the world. I think that's a difficult thing for a lot of people to get behind these days. There's like this sort of sense that like the U.S. should be very careful, very hands off, not get out into the world. And, with that vacuum of power, China fills it. I think,
there's a saying in academia that new paradigms are created at funerals. Okay. And I think a very similar type of idea holds even in geopolitics and things like that. If you look at a lot of real geopolitical shifts, there was some event that, for lack of a better term, tipped the scales, and it's like, okay, now we're going in a new direction. And so with China, China hasn't really precipitated an event that changes policy direction, even within the United States, to a significant degree, I think.
I mean, COVID should have.
I think Trump started steering in that new direction, but I don't think he said, we're going to, boom, take everything in a new direction. I think he started steering in that direction. And so I think under the Biden administration, I think they've just kind of like taken their foot off the gas pedal, for lack of a better direction. And so I really do fear to a degree that it would take something like a full-fledged invasion of Taiwan for people to realize what's really taken place. And I hope it doesn't come to that. But I do fear that it would take something like that for a lot of Americans to realize what's really taken place.
I don't know. The Nazis invaded Poland, and that didn't really. Well,
I mean, hey, for the United States, it was the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and so it would be very interesting what, if anything, would really change that, or if China. Continues to say, wait a minute, if we just don't precipitate anything like that, it's better for us.
Well, a lot of interesting things to think about after this podcast, I think. It's been very interesting having you on. I liked your thoughts about how we can leverage a bunch of different aspects of American society behind sort of a green investment in Southeast Asia and Africa.
And it's cheaper than the several $1 trillion that, Biden wants to spend on certain things.
One of the things that I think is important here is I think the best ambassadors for America are not necessarily the official ambassadors or politicians, though they absolutely play a role. I think it's getting Americans out into the world. And I think it is working with other countries, the people that will be, the Americans, businessmen that will go live in countries and help build up businesses in countries. And, people like myself that were professors in those countries and things like that. And I think, that's the strength. America has a real strength of the people that go and work with countries, and the entire environment of our country. I think I'm very proud of, and so I think if we can leverage that and say what can we do to help you as a country, and we share common concerns about China. What can we do to help you? I think that's the real cultural attractiveness of the American ideal.
Mm.
Oh, that's very well said. Nice note to end the podcast on. Yes, we can. Yes, we can make America great and build back better.
Wow, Chris.
You should be the ambassador that goes out into the world.
They'll love me. All right, Chris. Thanks again for joining us today.
Not a problem, guys. Hey, appreciate it as always.
Yeah, that was a very interesting interview. It reminds me of the old saying, looting and polluting is not the way. Hear how Captain Planet plans to fight the CCP.
It didn't rhyme.
It's not true if it doesn't rhyme, Chris.
Oh, this is why it's China Unscripted.
Mm-hmm.
If I had scripted that, it probably would have been better.
Yeah, maybe.
Or I just would have written what I said and then hoped you would have fixed it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, then I would have fixed it in the script.
Okay, so fix it now.
No.
Okay. Thanks for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
Was that it?
Do we have anything else we want to say? I guess I didn't give either of you an opportunity to share your
I have
thoughts.
nothing else I want to say.
One thing I did think was interesting about what Chris Paulding suggested was it is instead of trying to punish the CCP for doing what it's doing, it's trying to essentially take a positive action in the world.
Reward good behavior.
Or, I think you kind of have to do both things. Like you have to provide an alternative and you have to also sanction
tighten the screws on the CCP so it has less room to operate while ingratiating yourself with countries around the world.
But we've talked about this problem where like there are a lot of countries that there's no other choice for them but to work with the, you know.
I mean, often the CCP goes to dictators who don't want to have to deal with like investment from the West that also requires like political reform. But that's not the entire situation. A lot of it is like, we talked about the Solomon Islands recently. It's like the U.S. doesn't even have an embassy there. It's there's an opening for the U.S. to operate in, but
we're not doing it.
We're not doing it. And so then the option is China.
Pretty much. So yeah, I thought that was interesting that the idea is to go out and do something in the world.
Go forth, young man. Wasn't that from something?
I think you're thinking go west, young man.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Manifest destiny.
Yeah.
Am I advocating manifest destiny?
Let's not do that.
Okay, well, it's basically done already.
Yeah. Well, I feel like this is basically like your bits of American history that you learned in high school.
Just swimming around.
Yeah, like bubbling to the top suddenly.
I won't let China.
Young man.
I won't let China tax my stamps.
There you go.
I'm so glad we got these extra thoughts in.
I thought I made a good point.
You did.
Thanks, Shelley.
And thank you for watching. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Jung.
And I'm Matt Ganejda.
See you next time.